This is part 2 of the episode with special guest Cynthia Langtiw. And in this episode, we talk about trauma, how to utilize your own resources and feel connection and wholeness with yourself within trauma experiences, trauma in relation to couples and healing in relationships, as well as the experience of betrayal trauma, when the hand that feeds you is also the hand that hurts you. And we talk about that on a micro and macro level. Hello and welcome. You're listening to the Embody podcast, a show about remembering and embodying your true nature, inner wisdom, embodied healing, and self-love. My name is Candice Wu, and I'm a holistic healing facilitator, intuitive coach, and artist sharing my personal journey of vulnerability, offering meditations and guided healing support, and having co-creative conversations with healers and wellness practitioners from all over the world. This episode is supported by my listeners who have contributed on Patreon. If you found the podcast to be interesting, inspiring, healing, or supportive for you, and you want a way to contribute back, feel free to check out my page at candicewu.com/Patreon, where you can donate even just as little as $1 a month to support the production of the podcast and all of the love and details that go into every single episode. Thank you in advance for considering to donate. It really means a lot to me, and every single person that's on there just also adds in their energy towards the life of the podcast. So thank you, all of you out there. I'm thrilled to have Cynthia back for a second day here on the podcast. The podcast that went out yesterday, part 1, was all about being your best voice, believing in change and healing. It was about connection, ancestry and lineage, as well as decolonizing methodologies in research and in life. I really wanted Cynthia to come back to talk more about trauma because she is a trauma expert and she's just somebody that holds space for so many people that are suffering in the world. She's worked with refugee populations. She's worked with relationships and couples, as well as individuals who are experiencing trauma or have at some point in their life. And she sees people with such a beauty and wholeness that brings people to see their own wholeness. If you haven't listened to the first part of the episode yet, go ahead and find it at my website at candicewu.com/Cynthia, and that's CYNTHIA, or candicewu.com/EP64. I encourage you to listen because it's truly inspiring and even brought me to feeling this radiance within myself. Without further ado, let's jump in and talk to Cynthia. Welcome back, Cynthia. It's fantastic to have you here on the show again.
Thank you for having me back. I'm excited to continue our conversation.
Yeah, I was just so happy with our conversation and inspired, and I felt this vibrance and brilliance in my whole being. And I know that you work with a lot of trauma, and trauma is just such an important topic of the Embody podcast. A lot of people are tuning in because they have trauma, or they know of somebody, or they're just revealing to themselves, maybe I do have some trauma. And so I wanted to hear your wisdom on that. And specifically, I have read somewhere that you were talking about supporting people in utilizing their own resources to heal from trauma. So I'd love for you to talk about trauma and how you support that.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question so deeply. And I've come in my, years of doing this work to realize how pervasive trauma is. And so that's a bit heady and heavy to hold. But I also realize the spectrum. And so I think many people would shy away from the term trauma, big T or little t, because maybe they think of big events that happen. But what I find, and I did a workshop a couple of years ago, and I borrowed from Brene Brown, thinking about being wholehearted. And one of the things that connected for folks was the idea of being brokenhearted, like having pieces of yourself that don't feel completely connected. And so when I think about trauma, and the experience of trauma over the lifetime, I think about brokenheartedness and how we're meant to live wholeheartedly. But these breaks in relationships or these things that happen to us that we experience as traumatic leave us not feeling like we're able to live wholeheartedly. And so that gets to how I think about the impact of trauma. So much of the trauma that's long lasting is interpersonal. Now, there are some things that happen, so say a fire or a car accident, that are not necessarily interpersonal, but so much of the trauma that I see in the world, in my clients, in my day-to-day life is interpersonal trauma. And I find that to be especially difficult when it happens early on in life, when we're having less than optimal
Absolutely.
experiences from which to build, because that's when we build our foundational resources. We learn how to have an interaction with someone, have it be difficult, but get resources from our parents or caregivers about how to move through. We learn to feel sad. We learn to feel angry. We learn to feel happy. We learn to hold all of these resources, being able
Yeah,
to
or
manage
we
our,
don't.
or we don't, right? And so
Right.
that's where we ought to, I should say, that's where we ought to be learning those
Yes, right.
fundamental building blocks and resources that we draw upon later on, right? In order to move forward. If we don't get those initial building blocks, it becomes really difficult later on to even notice, one, that we don't have those resources, but then two, how to move on in life. And so when I talk about being resourced, I mean some of these very basic building blocks, how to communicate how to understand what we're feeling, how to communicate what we're feeling, how to understand what we need, how to ask for what we need, right? Um,
Absolutely.
the beauty is, though, when we realize that some of these resources are lacking or not there or were not available, we can start building them. So it's never too late to learn how to notice your emotions, to notice how something that happens to you is sitting in your body. I know that the whole somatic world is so important for you and your work, and it is for me as well. Like to notice, like what is happening in our bodies in response to a stimulus, any stimulus, what's happening emotionally, right? And then to be able to use some of
Hmm.
those and build resources from those is so important. And then the world opens up in terms of resources, right? Connecting with our emotions, connecting with ourselves, and then being able to connect with others in meaningful ways, in ways where we can share, in ways where we can emote, in ways where we can offer love, guidance, support, in ways that we can get love, guidance, support, right? True, deep emotional connection happens when we're connected to ourselves first. And that takes understanding important resources and then building upon them. I hope that starts to
Absolutely.
answer your question.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I am hooking into that experience of most trauma being within an interpersonal relationship and in the context of a relationship, therefore needing a relationship to support the healing. And, where do we learn the building blocks of how to feel something in ourselves by ourselves?
Yeah.
If we don't have that, we just don't have it.
We
And
don't. Yeah. And it's so
right.
important. Right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the other thing I was thinking, what you said early on in this question, something I've been thinking about a lot, and something people ask me is, do you see practically everything as relating to trauma? And I see trauma as something that's incomplete, that wanted some completion in some way, whether that's staying with a feeling that just didn't get enough space or time, or
Mm-hmm.
a fight or something being said that felt like it wanted to happen instinctually but didn't get a chance to, or you
Yeah.
protected in a way.
Yeah.
Um, and
Yeah.
and so I just see these little and big things happening to us
Mm-hmm.
all the
Mm-hmm.
time. Like we
Yeah.
don't scream at
Yeah.
our boss because you know we want to protect our job,
Right.
or
Right.
and that has perhaps a whole branch of other experiences linked with it. But
Yeah.
do you see it that way, or what is your thought about
I
that?
think that's such a beautiful way of putting it. Things that aren't finished, be it the most minute, seemingly, I should say, seemingly minute fissures, right? Maybe you didn't get something you wanted, or there was a need a want that felt like a need that didn't get met, that you don't even realize in the moment. Or, as babies, that happens and there's no language.
Right.
Actually, there are no words, I should say. There is, some
Mm.
language in terms of interaction. And so I think that really links into what I was thinking about in terms of being brokenhearted, right? These events, emotions, these things that happen that don't have resolution, or that leave us feeling not complete, right? But I think that
Mm-hmm.
sometimes those are, I think of those as opportunities, right? I think of moments that we don't get what we need, or what we want, I should say, as opportunities to build. Like, then how do we then move towards communicating about that need with our caregiver? How do we let them know? How does the caregiver then help repair by offering what it is that we need? So I don't think that those fissures are necessarily problematic. They're problematic when they aren't complete, when there isn't resolution, when we don't learn how to move through. Right. And that's when we're left brokenhearted. So I think the idea of not having resolution, not completing, from the minute to the very large, is so important. Whenever someone tells me of something that happened to them that has left them feeling sad or traumatized, if they use those words, I ask them, what happened when you told someone?
Mm.
What happened when you communicated to someone? And what I've found, by and large, is that the events that happen are often very painful and difficult. But what many people experience as a second trauma, and sometimes even
Mm-hmm.
more impactful, is how someone else responded, either callously, or not fully, or not completely because they weren't resourced, or negatively or harshly, right?
Mm-hmm.
Has such a long lasting impact. The words that were said, the look on a face, has such a long lasting impact. Similarly, when someone has had something really difficult happen and they receive love when they communicate, they receive compassion, they receive vulnerability in response to their own vulnerability, there's such a different way that they talk
Mm-hmm.
about their experience, you know? And so I think that that's another really important piece, is understanding the intense power of pain, but also healing that can, and I think must, happen in the context of relationship.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's
And,
beautiful. Thank you.
the other piece to that just made me think, and I think so much of it happens in the context of relationship. But for me, as someone who is a lifelong reader, I think if I wasn't a clinical psychologist or professor, I would be a librarian or a
Oh.
spy, right? Um,
Yes, we know that
uh,
one.
I would be a librarian because for me, and especially as an immigrant child, reading books was how I entered the world, like how I came to understand and make sense of the world. And sometimes seeing another person, even a fictional character's experience, resonated so profoundly and deeply with and for me that it changed me. There are ways that I've been healed by hearing and seeing a character in a book heal. There are ways that I've felt validated. Like, I think about Pecola Breedlove from Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. I've only ever read
Mm-hmm.
that book once because it shook my soul to know that another little girl had this experience of being Black in America.
Mm.
And so there are ways that I've felt so seen in the context of a novel that it's overwhelming. And I think that's another really beautiful way that we can connect with ourselves and with others, interpersonally.
Absolutely. I'm just thinking about a book that I read when I was in fourth grade.
Mm-hmm.
Oh goodness, what is it called? It was a book about the Holocaust.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I can just see the cover. It's red. It's got two children on it and the Star of David right in the middle of it. And I was just enthralled with reading about the Holocaust and reading stories like this. And it was a fictional book, but
Mm-hmm.
just what you're saying, something in it touched me even at that really young age. And I
Yeah.
had no clue why. I'm a
Right.
Chinese American girl at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
who knows why I'm just like engrossed in this. And
Yeah.
it's terrifying, yet also very healing. And
Mm-hmm.
later in life, I just felt very connected with something in me. I can name it as maybe it was a past life experience of being
Mm-hmm.
Jewish or something.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But aside from that, even there was something in me about hiding in this life.
Ah,
And so, whatever it
wow.
was, there was just so much
Yeah.
there that was in an
Mm-hmm.
unspoken version of me, but read through these stories. So, I
Yeah.
completely relate to what you're saying, and we can find so much in story.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think that speaks to relationship too. Like there's a relationship that I had with Pacola Breedlove, right? And with
Mm.
Toni Morrison. There's a relationship that you had with these two characters that was meaningful for you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And you said to me one time when we were speaking, feeling grounded across time and space was really important with finding resource around healing trauma, but
Oh,
knowing you're not just in this moment by yourself, but
yeah.
that you're with your
Yeah.
ancestors as well
Yeah.
as those to come. And that
Yeah.
really resonated with me. Can you say more?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, with respect to literature, I think one of the things that can feel so difficult is when we feel untethered, unconnected,
Mm-hmm.
alone, and lonely. Not just alone, but lonely, as if we're solitary in this world. And I realized one of the important resources for me, and I'm blessed to come from a line and to have known, some of the really important matriarchs, my grandmothers, Andrea Hippolyte, and Stephanie Jean-Louis being the two that I
Mm.
think about most prominently. And they're no longer here physically on earth with us, but they're with me every day, and in moments where I feel like, oh my gosh, I have this task before me, I often stand very still and call upon them. And I feel their courage buoy me, and I feel the courage of
Mm.
all the women whose shoulders on which they stood. I feel the courage of my ancestors grounding me. And I also think about, like, I have these two boys, and I think about who they'll bring into the world, who they'll love, who will love them, and all of the progeny, like who will come from my family. And I feel grounded both in the past with my grandmothers, but also with who and what's to come. And there's a way that I can't feel alone in the world when I really ground myself in both the past and the future. And I feel tethered, but not torn in both ways. And that's such an important inner resource for me. And I think that, and I hope that my kids feel that way. I certainly know that my siblings feel that way, but I hope that more people really stop to think about, the ways that they can ground themselves in both the past and the future.
Mm.
In the ways that they are. And sometimes that can be really challenging because as wonderful and amazing as my grandmothers are, I have these beautiful memories, but there's some painful memories, in the
Yeah.
past as well. And I know the important work that you do around intergenerational family work, that there's some pain that can be there as well. And so I say that knowing that those inner resources that come from the past and the future are complicated.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
Right.
yeah, and that's very real as well. And I honor that. I honor that it's complex.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's very real. Thank you. So
Hmm.
you're doing trauma work with couples as well, and you were writing a book.
Yes, yes. So it's one of the books that's at the forefront of my spirit. I feel like it's
Yeah.
not even something that I've come up with, but that it's come to me. And in recent years, I've just come to see so clearly with all the amazing couples with whom I work. And I don't know how people find me, but whenever a couple leaves my office, I think, wow, what amazing people I get to work with, you know. And I just
Yeah.
feel so honored that they let me in their lives and let me in their couplehood. And what I've found with almost all of the couples, if not all of the couples with whom I've worked, is that when there are significant challenges, that there often is a trauma or multiple traumas that have been experienced, right? And so what happens is that, and often it's both members of the couple
Hmm.
that have experienced significant trauma that they're working through or need to work through, or maybe never even realized was situated in them as a traumatic experience or series of experiences. And so I find much of my work is helping them recognize, one, the trauma that they've experienced, and how it's showing up in the context of relationship, how it's keeping them from being vulnerable with each other, how there are moments that are happening around self-preservation that are not about what's happening in this moment, but that are tethered to the past, connected to the past trauma, but are showing up right now. And so how can I be
Hmm.
a compassionate, partner? Right? How can I understand this as related to the trauma? And so give some space for my partner to be and to work through. How can I, as the partner who is living out, working through a traumatic experience in the context of the here and now, communicate with my partner what I'm learning about myself, what I'm understanding about myself, what I'm not understanding, but recognizing might not be related to what's happening with this partner here, but maybe something that's happened in the past. And I find that my work as the psychologist in this space is to offer some space to see the dynamics that are happening. What's happening in the here and now? What's related to past trauma? What is being worked through right now? And how can we understand how all of it is situated together? It's a really delicate dance. And, but it's a dance that the couples are doing every day and maybe not
Hmm.
recognizing how it's playing out for them. I keep coming back to in the work that I do with couples is how one of the things that, one of the papers that I read years ago, I mean, it must have been like 25 years ago, and it stayed with me, Susan Sands. And
Hmm.
she's, I think she comes from a self-psychology perspective, but the title of the paper, I think, was What is Dissociated? And the premise of the paper was what's dissociated is connection, right? Like, so when somebody experiences a trauma, what happens is it cuts off their ability to connect, right? And it was
Hmm.
so powerful to me because it was so clear. And so when someone starts moving away in the context of relationship, a partner, it's because they're trying to protect themselves. And so we talk about what it is they're trying to protect, the ways that they're trying to disconnect as a means of self-preservation, and how at some point that was working for them. They had to do that. That was how they protected themselves. But that strategy is no longer working in the context of this relationship, because what you want to do is move closer to your partner, not away from your partner, right? You want to move
Right.
towards intimacy, and that disconnection, that lack of vulnerability, that self-protection and self-preservation is moving away from intimacy rather than towards intimacy. And that's a big ask. That's a big ask for someone who has had to protect themselves and has used strategies that have kept them alive in some cases to say, okay, I get it. It made total sense at some point in time. But right now, it's not the strategy that's helping you move towards your goals. And so how can we say thank you to that strategy and put it aside while we're trying to employ strategies that can help us move towards our goals in the here and now?
I think that's such a powerful experience to shed the past strategies and recognize they were helpful. And that feels to me now, as you're talking about it, one of the signals of trauma. We keep using a strategy over and over, even when it's not presently useful anymore. And we can get locked in that reaction or pattern where we keep on doing the thing that's not helpful to now because we have disconnected with the moment or with the vulnerability of now. And so, yeah. And you spoke about intimacy, and we have talked in the past about intimacy, how to have true intimacy. Can you speak about that? What is true intimacy?
Yeah. I mean, I think that we all desire to be, our complete selves. I talk about being able to, like with the couples with whom I work, to be able to walk in the door and feel like you can breathe free, right? You can be your whole self. My good friend, Dr. Tracy Rodgers, talks about bringing your whole self to the table. She's Trinidadian. And the importance of being able to
how does
bring
she say it? I
your
love it.
whole self, your whole self. I love her so much.
I love it.
And it's really, and I say that with such fondness because she is a friend of my heart and someone with whom I can bring my whole self, and being able to be laid bare before someone else, right? And have that be and know that that's completely okay. Be able to be vulnerable. That's the stuff of relationship, because it's in that quivery, open, laid bare, vulnerable space that we truly connect with another human being, right? And what this quandary that I find, because I find that oftentimes what we're trying to do in relationship, the couples with whom I work and I myself, is put my best foot forward, right? Like I want you to see the shiny parts. I want you to see the glimmer. I want you to see the glitz and how amazing I am. We want our partners to think that we're, the gold standard. And yet what breeds true intimacy are those more difficult moments. The stuff that isn't shiny, the stuff that's patched over, but that needs to be unpatched and healed because it never healed in the first place, and so that's the paradox, is that we want so much to be connected. We want to be connected. So we put on the mask, we put on the show, we put on the glitz, the glamour, the gold. And yet the paradox is that it's those quivery moments. It's the patched up parts. It's the truth of who we are that allows the vulnerability, that breeds the kind of authentic connection we're actually looking for, right?
Yeah,
We
it is
connect.
such a quandary. Like when you put it like that. Like, well, of course.
Yeah, we don't connect. Not really. I mean, yeah, we're attracted to someone, but we fall in love, like deeply in love with the parts of each other that are quivery and vulnerable and real and authentic.
I could not say that better.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, and we become that glittery facade version of ourselves because it seemingly worked at some point, and
Yeah,
we just keep
sure.
on going,
We do.
and yet our soul yearns to connect with the messy,
Yes.
painful
Oh,
parts too.
yes.
And so we want to see that in each
Absolutely.
other. We want
Mm-hmm.
help with each other
Yeah.
to see those parts of ourselves
Yeah. Yeah. And
as well.
the more vulnerability, the more connection. If we're able to accept ourselves and then accept the other and keep accepting the other and keep accepting the other and keep accepting the other. And so I see a big part of my work as a couples therapist is to help, partners, one, accept themselves and keep creating space for vulnerability and true authentic connection, and to keep opening up that space, right?
Hmm.
I mean, yeah, that's the work.
Yeah, it is. And I find in conjunction with that, the keep accepting the other and keep accepting yourself and the other and self. It's such a fine balance. I guess just personally, I've experienced accepting the other without accepting self
Mm,
it can tip over into that
yeah,
and somehow neglected myself
yes.
or accepted.
Mm,
I think it's a fine line of what accepting someone's vulnerability and their experience and what they're sharing, but not accepting something that doesn't feel good to you in terms of like a
mm-hmm,
treatment or
mm-hmm.
way of relating or
Right, right, right.
experience. Yeah.
Oh, I, I, I say this from deep, deep experience with that very thing you just shared, Candice, that resonated for me so deeply where personally I was so accepting of the other that I couldn't even see myself anymore, which
Hmm.
actually is a false acceptance of that other
Hmm.
person because I didn't trust them enough to be completely myself. And so it wasn't
Ooh,
really
yeah.
accepting them. I didn't fully accept them if I don't fully accept myself and have boundaries for myself. Like I can love you completely and say, this is how I'm going to love you from afar or up close, or we can continue this piece because it's what's right for both of us. Right.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so that what you just said resonated so deeply. There isn't a way that I can deeply accept someone else or say that I do without being fully real. Because then there's a part of me that knows that what I'll get in response won't be okay, won't be enough. I'm not enough. So I have to shrink back or disappear in order to show up for this person, which isn't trusting them and isn't trusting their
Right.
abilities.
Their
Um,
wholeness, their ability
mhm,
to accept you,
mhm,
to accept more, or
yeah,
um,
yeah,
be
yeah,
respectful, or
mhm,
to hold
mhm,
that. Yeah,
yeah,
I love how you described how that works in complete tandem.
mhm, yeah,
It's no separation.
right. And it takes so much courage to be in relationship. It takes so much self-compassion, compassion for others. It takes having clear and appropriate boundaries. So that's something that we learn. And if we didn't learn, can learn, right?
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and so it's quite a bit of work to be, fully in relationship. And yet, I think it's how we're meant to be, not necessarily partnered. I'm talking about relationships, period. I absolutely believe that we were meant to be in deep, connected relationships. And sometimes that looks like being partnered. Sometimes it looks like having, you know, a family relationship. Sometimes it looks like a best friendship. Sometimes it looks like XYZ, um,
Mm-hmm.
a parent, a
Mm-hmm.
child. But I absolutely believe that we were meant to be in deep, authentic, connected relationships. We were and are built for it. I do.
Absolutely. I can see, I feel that.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah. So there's one other topic that I'm interested in, and let me know how you're feeling now about it, is betrayal trauma and
Hmm.
both micro and macro levels of that. And
Yeah.
uh, yeah, I just want to start with what you had written, I think somewhere in a profile about betrayal trauma.
Hmm.
And you mentioned psychologist Jennifer, is it Freyd or Freyd?
Hmm. Hmm.
That she identified betrayal trauma as a type of trauma that occurs when people or institutions on which a person depends for existence significantly violate that person's trust and
Yeah.
well being. And that you mentioned it's particularly harmful because one's sense of trust, their connectedness, and their well being is compromised.
Yeah. Absolutely. And so for years, I worked with children and I still do. And I saw this so clearly, the confusion that happens when a child who is supposed to rely on their caregiver, right? They have to rely on their caregiver, is betrayed by that caregiver. That I have found to be some of the most long lasting, ingrained, embedded type of trauma that's the most difficult to, from which to heal. And what I found over time is what Dr. Freyd shared, is that the mechanism that happens is that the very hand that's supposed to care for you and feed you is the hand that's slapping you and hurting you. And yet you still need to be fed in order to have sustenance and to live. Your very survival depends upon you figuring out how to manage this double-edged hand, if you will, that both feeds and hurts you. And so you figure out strategies, right? To both get the
Mm-hmm.
sustenance that you need from that hand, but to also know when to run away, know when to protect yourself, know when to how to care for yourself. It's a very unstable, difficult is an understatement, traumatic
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
way to grow up. And I saw so many kids who had that double-edged hand, if you will, that sometimes fed them, sometimes hurt them. And they had to learn how to ingratiate themselves. They had to learn how to, you know, manage all of that in order to survive. And so they came up with strategies to figure out how to do that. And so then part of my work as a clinical psychologist with the kids who were now adults, right, who are in
Mm-hmm.
couples, is to learn what patterns were learned in the context of that relationship, how to unlearn the patterns that weren't helpful and how to come up with strategies that are. What I came to realize, and I'm only going to touch upon this briefly because it's so profound, so heady, so large that it gives me pause, is that that very same pattern that I saw with the kids who became adults, who'd experienced betrayal trauma in the context of their caregiving relationship, that pattern was happening on a micro level in the family between parents and children or caregivers and children, but that pattern happens on a macro level. And I wrote a paper in which I reflected on how Black children in particular in both the Dominican Republic and the US, but I think that other people, children, experience betrayal
Mm-hmm.
trauma on a macro level. And what do I mean by this? What I mean is that there are structures in place that systematically discriminate and harm Black youth, Black children, Black boys in particular.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a form of betrayal trauma. So you have these Black youth that are going to hospitals, to schools, to all of these systems that are supposed to care for them. And yet within those systems, they are betrayed. They are actually harmed, right? The criminal justice system. As a mother of multiracial kids who present as Black, my heart cannot comprehend what parents like Tamir Rice's parents, who was, a 12-year-old boy who was killed on a playground, what his parents must be experiencing, what Trayvon Martin's parents must continue to experience. How on a macro level, these institutions are supposed to care for, our children and yet are systematically betraying them is heady. And so what does that look like then in the work that I do, right? In the work that I do, clients come in and they've experienced betrayal trauma at the hands of their caregivers, but they've also experienced betrayal trauma on a macro level and feel currently discriminated against and pained. And one of the things that I see as part of my job is to name that, to name that they should be treated better, to name that the feelings that they're having are real and a normative response. Psychologists talk about a healthy paranoia that some Black people have, how that's actually somewhat adaptive, right, in the face of this large-scale macro betrayal trauma. And I think that by naming that together, that we can begin to look at the psychological and emotional and spiritual impact, right? And also biological impact, right? Like all of it, and begin to work on it because we're recognizing how large it is and how these larger systems are complicit in terms of structural violence and systematic inequality. The fact that school systems where people pay higher taxes are better is just accepted is unacceptable. Like we just accept that as par for the course. That's ridiculous.
It is.
And that's part of the betrayal trauma that can happen on a macro level. And I name that. And I name that as it's related to how the clients that I see, how the people that I see working through their lives experience the world and experience within themselves, and can take that on as something that's problematic about them. So similar to kids who have experienced betrayal trauma in the context of, their caregiving relationships, can take it on as they were bad. There's something defective about them as a child. That's why it happened to them. I name that was not the case. In a similar way, I name that for the clients that experience betrayal trauma on a macro level.
When you were talking about this, naming it, I was just thinking how much of an impact that actually can have, to validate someone's experience as real. And even if it's the paranoia that is adaptive, whereas if someone said, well, you don't have to be afraid or paranoid, like that just invalidates everything. But when we can feel so helpless about this larger macro level betrayal and aggression and hurt, it can just feel heady. It can feel so big, like what do we even do about it? But I'm just reminded how these small droplets of validation and naming it, shifting just even a tiny baby step away from silence and invalidation, it's like a homeopathy that can do so much for one individual, and that can ripple out into their community or their loved one, or just being for themselves.
Yeah.
In that knowing of one person believed me or felt me and understands my pain or suffering. It's huge.
Yeah. I love the
Thank
way you
you.
put that, homeopathy. And it is, right? Like that.
Yeah.
Oh, that's powerful. Yeah.
Yeah, like to not bypass how important these little tiny pieces of vulnerability can be and are.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Wow.
Mm.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing these really, really important pieces. And I agree. It's just so almost too profound and big to give it justice in the words here. But I appreciate what you're doing. And um, I feel that love for people come through here in terms of people who are experiencing that on a very large level.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
That's so meaningful to me. Thank you. Thank you.
It's been incredible again to be talking with you and for you to share what you're working on and what's inspiring you, what's also paining you in your heart. And is there anything else you want to share?
I think I started all of this by saying we're at our best when we're connected to ourselves and when we're connected to others. And this work that you're doing to help reflect on how to do that is the stuff of life. And I so deeply appreciate it. So, thank you, Candice.
Thank you, Cynthia. I could not agree more with that for you, about you. And it's just so wonderful that you exist and you're doing this work with people, and that you exist as who you are in the world.
Mm.
And I look forward to the interlog experience that you're offering.
I'm
And
so
thank
excited.
you. Yes.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, thank you so much. I learned so much, and let's end it here. And just, I'm so grateful. It was such a pleasure to have Cynthia on the show, and I'm so glad all of you are out there listening in. I hope it's helpful to you and supports you in finding some of your own belief in yourself, belief in your wholeness, or even helps you see where you're feeling brokenhearted and where you want to take another step for yourself. Be sure to check out Cynthia's Experiential on Interlogs. In the first part of her episode, part 1, she talks about interlogs as a way of reflecting on your own process. If you're a researcher, if you're examining something and how your interaction affects the process and what kind of transformation goes on within you. But she's taking this to another level with interlogs and opening up to apply to anyone that's looking at themselves and their process in any way. Maybe you're an artist, maybe you're doing healing work or some sort of art, healing arts or something that you can use this process to explore into yourself in a different way. So that episode will be coming out later this week. Look out for it. And again, you can find her full podcast with that experiential on the website with all the show notes and links at candicewu.com/Cynthia or /EP64. Before you go, I'd love to invite you to hop onto my newsletter that comes out twice a month. This gives some updates about where I am in the world, what I'm healing and thinking about, as well as self-love notes that can support you in loving yourself more deeply, healing aspects of yourself, and it also keeps you up to date on any workshops or retreats that are happening. You can find everything at candicewu.com/embody. One last thing I want to mention is I encourage you to reach out to Cynthia if you're interested in her work, if you'd like to stay in touch about her book that will be coming out. I'm not sure when, but if you want to stay in the loop, and if you want to contact her about speaking engagements to invite her to your workplace or other places, reach out to her. The show notes will connect you directly. If you're interested in reaching out to me to connect or to explore if we might be a good fit for healing work, feel free to reach out to me at candicewu.com/connect, where you can set up a free 20-minute consultation. And there's no pressure to go forward. It's just 20 minutes we get together where we can talk about what you desire, what you want in your life for yourself, how you're feeling and how you're doing. And we can explore your next steps or check out how constellations or somatic experiencing might support you, or I also give recommendations for other healers and therapists that may be a good fit for you. So that's at CandiceWu.com/connect. I'm so glad you're here, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. See you next time on the Embody podcast.